Hello and welcome to Euronews Tonight. Here are some of our top stories. Omicron advances globally at a rapid pace. What experts believe is the most aggressive and fastest spreading coronavirus variant is putting Europe on edge. Italy going hard after the unvaccinated. New measures aim to exclude them from many public events and services. Olaf Scholz appoints MP and prominent epidemiologist Karl Lauterbach as Germany's new health minister, a strong advocate of mandatory vaccinations. And Myanmar's deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi gets a 2-year jail sentence, the first verdict in a series of cases that could send her to prison for decades. Welcome to the program. I'm Stefan Grobe. The Omicron variant that's now been detected in nearly 40 countries around the world could become the dominant COVID strain within weeks. Russia, Croatia, Nepal and Argentina all reported their first cases on Monday. US health officials say the variant has spread to at least 16 states. New York says private employers will be asked to mandate COVID vaccines for employees. South Africa, where Omicron was first detected, is preparing hospitals for further admissions as case numbers push the country into a fourth COVID-19 wave. Poland's prime minister says new tighter COVID restrictions will be announced this week. Compulsory jabs for certain professions and vaccine certificates could be among some of the measures being introduced. Poland has seen an increase in infections. Only 54% of people in Poland have been fully vaccinated. People wanting to go to a bar, a restaurant, a cinema in Italy will have to show proof of vaccination or proof of having recently recovered from COVID-19. The so-called Super Green Pass is also now required at sporting events and clubs. The tightening of measures also include fines for those found without a valid pass or a negative test on public transport. 80% of people in Italy have been fully immunized so far, with 15% having received a third dose of the COVID jab. Joining me now from Rome is our correspondent, Georgia Orlandi. Georgia, good evening and good to see you. So Italy has already asked every worker to have the basic green pass. What is changing now?
Well, hi, Stefan. Well, despite the fact that over 80% of the population has been fully vaccinated, it seems that the government is still determined to continue to clamp down on the no-vax movement, the no-green pass movement. And despite the fact that the overall number of COVID cases has increased here in Italy, the government says the situation is under control and there's no need to make vaccination compulsory. Now, the new measures which, according to Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi, are needed to preserve what he calls normality, to give certainty to the tourist holiday season, come into effect today and will last until the 15th of January with the option of being extended further into 2022. It seems that the strategy has already paid off. Over 1 million passes have been issued in the past 24 hours. But what is the Super Green Pass about? Well, it's a reinforced version of the already existing Green Pass. Italy's health certificate showing the holder has been fully vaccinated against COVID, has recovered from the disease or has tested negative for COVID. It is normally required to access social, sporting, cultural venues, but the difference now is that the new certificate only applies to those people who've been fully vaccinated or have recovered from the disease. Clearly, the move aims to target those people who have not been vaccinated, who won't be allowed to access a number of social venues, as you mentioned there, theatres, cinemas, and so on. So far, the government believes that this is the best option available and the only alternative to making vaccination compulsory. Stefan?
Well, it's important to note that the resistance to vaccinations will be quite expensive from now on. Tell us about the hefty fines and the public reactions to them.
Well, Stefan, together with the Super Green Pass now, mask wearing has become also compulsory in larger shopping areas. And we know the police are carrying out random Green Pass checks with the first fines that have been imposed today. People who don't comply with the rules risk fines between 400 and 1,000 euros. But also doubts remain as to how to enforce the new rules on public transport. We know that according to the latest decree, not only the Super Green Pass has been introduced, but now passes based on testing will also be required on public transport. So there have been a few local governors say that, for example, in the case of students, as students are not required to show the certificate when they enter schools, well, clearly that poses a problem. But the government does not want to change approach for now. As you can imagine, the latest measures have divided Italians between those who support the measure. They believe that they don't want to be subjected to the same restrictions as those people who have not been vaccinated. And then you've got those people who have not been vaccinated who think that these restrictions will limit further their freedoms. More protests are likely to take place in the next few days. But as we've seen when the Green Pass was extended to all workplaces, it might also happen that they will fizzle pretty soon in the next few weeks. Stefan?
All right, Giorgia Orlandi in Rome for us. Thank you very much. Germany's next Chancellor Olaf Scholz has presented his 7 ministerial picks for the new coalition government. The Social Democrats will take charge of several government offices, including Labour and Social Affairs, the Interior, Defence and Health. Scholz's pick to take on the Health Minister portfolio is physician Karl Lauterbach. Lauterbach, who became a firm fixture on German TV during the pandemic, takes on the job at a difficult time. COVID cases are surging. Restrictions on unvaccinated people have been tightened, and the possibility of mandatory vaccines is being considered.
We have to fight this pandemic. The pandemic will last longer than many think, but we will manage it. Vaccination will play the central role, but not the only role. And in addition to that, we will strengthen the health system. An important aim must be to bring the case numbers down so far that we can recommend travel without endangering people. We will put emphasis on that, great emphasis.
Let's talk about the new German cabinet with Kate Brady, who is in Berlin for us. Good evening, Kate. So I got to ask you about Karl Lauterbach, a Harvard professor and a regular on TV talk shows, who has emerged as one of the country's most trusted pandemic experts. It looks like his appointment was a shoo-in.
Well, there was certainly still an element of surprise to him ultimately being appointed as the health minister today. The announcement was really hotly anticipated, more so than at any previous new cabinet announcement. But it wasn't so much of a huge surprise, as you say. There had been a lot of growing support, especially on social media, after his appearances on talk shows as well. But there hadn't always been that much support for him within the Social Democrats. Many of his fellow SPD colleagues saying that a lot of his appearances were more about his own ego, and he had also even been targeted by certain members of the far right as well, facing threats because of some of his calls at times during the pandemic for prompt and especially tighter measures in Germany's handling of the pandemic. So it was a surprise to a certain degree that he did ultimately get the job, but it seems Olaf Scholz, the designated chancellor, the designated successor to Angela Merkel, has certainly put his confidence in Karl Lauterbach, and there wasn't all that much discontent being voiced here in Germany today about Karl Lauterbach being appointed as the health minister. Of course, the hope now is that he will be able to put his expertise in epidemiology to good use in this role. If there was any discontent today, it was more at the lack of diversity now that we're seeing very clearly in the new cabinet. Out of 16 ministerial positions, only two ministers actually come from the former East, and only one minister, the Agriculture Minister Cem Özdemir, is of migrant descent. And so that really has caused some concerns here today, especially in a cabinet that was supposed to be becoming more diverse and more open compared to previous cabinets. At the same time, they have managed to just about achieve gender equality. If you take Olaf Scholz out of the equation, there are now 8 men and 8 women in Olaf Scholz's new cabinet.
Let me get back to Lauterbach. He is an advocate of stronger COVID measures, right? But so was his predecessor Jens Spahn. Do we know what's going to change under Lauterbach?
Well, one of the big differences, even Jens Spahn, the outgoing health minister, said himself just at the end of last week that when the proposal to make vaccines against COVID-19 made to be mandatory, when that bill is put to the Bundestag, to the German parliament, Jens Spahn said that he's going to vote against it. This is something, actually, a vaccine mandate is something that Lauterbach is very much behind, and it will be on his watch now this coming week that the proposal will be put to the Bundestag, and effectively in the end, if it gets that far, will be put into place. And we're expecting, if there is going to be a vaccine mandate here in Germany, that could be as soon as February, if not early March. First of all, for healthcare workers, that's the expectation, at least for now. And then the second step, what we're hearing, is most likely for all citizens here in Germany, all people living here in Germany. At the same time, of course, the situation is developing extremely quickly right now, as we're seeing across Europe. And so it's certainly not completely off the cards that we could see some more measures put in place in the coming weeks. But of course, that is something that's decided both at a federal and state level, and not something that would just be decided by Mr. Lauterbach himself.
All right, Kate Brady in Berlin. Thank you very much for this update. Myanmar's deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi has been given a 2-year prison term after being found guilty of incitement and of breaching COVID-19 restrictions. Suu Kyi was originally handed a 4-year sentence, but hours later it was reduced. The verdict in this trial, widely seen as politically motivated, has been internationally condemned. Deputy Director for Human Rights in Asia, Phil Robertson, told us she's sure to receive more sentences.
It's quite clear this will be the first of many sentences that she's going to receive, because the military junta in Myanmar is really piling it on her. There's multiple charges, even more severe than these ones, which have been brought against her and which she's being tried for. And I expect that it's going to be the same kind of outcome, that, these are politically motivated trials in front of a compromised lapdog judiciary that does what the military wants. The international community will certainly bring out many statements of denunciation. But what they need to do is they need to impose a global arms embargo. They need to sanction oil and gas revenues and other revenues that are really critical for the junta to continue to operate. And they need to put pressure on the UN Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court, because crimes against humanity are being committed against the people day in, day out in Myanmar.
France's far-right presidential candidate Éric Zemmour promised to reconquest against decades of decline in his first electoral rally on Sunday. Scuffles broke out with anti-racism protesters, leaving at least 5 people injured. Zemmour was grabbed by the neck during the rally, with a man put in custody by police. In a separate event, the French Republican Party selected Valérie Pécresse, a moderate politician from the Paris region, to challenge President Emmanuel Macron next year. It's the first time the French Republican Party picks a woman as its candidate. Let's bring in Annelies Borges now, who has been following the presidential race in France very closely for us. So, good evening, Annelies. Let me ask you this. If I were Emmanuel Macron, would I need to be worried about the heightened activity on the right?
This is a very good question. Emmanuel Macron doesn't seem to be too worried, at least for now, but the contours of this race have started to be laid out, and the most prominent names on the right are proof that France has indeed lurched towards that political side of the spectrum, the side of the political spectrum, rather. The most prominent names are coming from the right and the far right. And despite skepticism from a majority of political analysts here in this country, one name in particular seems to be electrifying this race so far. Eric Zemmour, who, just like Emmanuel Macron 5 years ago, launched his political movement and embarked on this formidable challenge to reform and perhaps reinvent France. Eric Zemmour is now the novelty, the novice, the fresh blood, as one of his supporters told me yesterday, who seemingly out of nowhere has been gaining support and laid now his strategy. In a defiant speech yesterday in the outskirts of Paris, he kickstarted his campaign by saying that he and his supporters, this movement, are a small grain of sand that came to clog the political machinery here in this country. He delivered a defiant message saying that he will fight for France, he will fight to reconquest France. He said that he wants to restore its former glory. It was almost like, let's make France great again. He said that he accused the government and the media of ostracizing him and his supporters, of ignoring his message and their desires. The irony could not be missed, of course. Eric Zemmour is a famous TV pundit who had his own show on French television. During that speech, he also laid out some of his program. He talked about investing on the French industry. He talked about the creation of jobs. He talked about raising the minimum salary, also distributing bonuses for those who get the minimum pay, and explained how he will drastically reduce the number of asylum seekers allowed here in this country.
Why is it that France has been pivoting so strongly to the right? I mean, there are now two viable candidates on the extreme right, plus the traditional center-right party now seems to have regained its footing.
Indeed, many political analysts are talking about the right and are talking about this shift. You talked about the two far-right candidates, one being Eric Zemmour, the other one being the most traditional far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen, who inherited the far-right movement from her father, a very controversial figure here in France, and of course Valérie Pécresse in the more mainstream center-right, another woman for the first time representing that camp. Why the shift? Well, there are different opinions here in France as to why that happened, but there are certainly some arguments that the right has championed throughout the years that have been gaining ground and support among voters, notably, of course, the issue of migration, one that has been populating a very divisive debate here in this country as to the size of the migrant population that is compatible with French values, just the number of migrants that should be accepted, how to include them in society, but also the issue of security that many political analysts and politicians have started to mix with that of migration. So that explosive combination is one that has been picked up by many here in this country and has been gaining ground among voters. What is going to be interesting to see, of course, in the next few weeks and months of this race is just how much ground this has actually gained and whether or not these people who are now saying they favor a far-right candidate will actually go to the polls and make this drastic call and vote for far-right, especially a drastic call being this being France, of course.
All right, Annelies Borges in Paris, thank you very much, and stay on it. Leaders of far-right parties from across Europe have met in Warsaw to discuss how they might work together to reduce the EU's decision-making powers. But they failed to agree on forming a new political group. Shandor Siros reports.
Leaders of European far-right and populist parties have failed to agree on founding a new political group in the European Parliament. Leaders such as France's Marine Le Pen and Hungary's Viktor Orban attended the high-level meeting in Warsaw over the weekend, but they left with just a statement highlighting the need for closer cooperation against the power of the Brussels institutions.
It is not the commissioners, it is not the administration, and it is not the bureaucrats or the directors in the European Commission who will decide how we should live.
If the radical populist parties were to unite in the European Parliament, they could form the third biggest political group, giving them some serious influence. But despite agreeing on issues of national sovereignty, migration and Euroscepticism, the ruling Polish Law and Justice Party is reluctant to join because they could lose influence.
While Identity and Democracy and its member parties are largely isolated in the European Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists, and especially Law and Justice, isn't. They have rapporteurs, shadow rapporteurs in the European Parliament. ECR also has a committee presidency.
But there are also issues they disagreed on, like relations with Russia. While Francis Le Pen has close ties with Putin, Poland is in the opposite camp. There are also internal divisions, like in Italy between La Lega and the Brothers of Italy. In the short term, EU mainstream parties shouldn't be worried.
This is now a lar pour lar media happening. The one thing which benefits all of the participants is that they can shape the political agenda, they can get media attention, and that's the whole reason behind this repeated radical right forums throughout the year, which always fail to produce any kind of tangible results.
The parties involved say they will organize the next conference in Spain within the following months. Sándor Zsíros, Euronews, Brussels.
The southernmost tip of the world has experienced the only total solar eclipse of 2021. But apart from a small group of people, only the local wildlife witnessed it. Rebecca Daunt reports.
This rare astronomical spectacle was experienced in Antarctica by just a handful of scientists, tourists, and the odd penguin or two. The frozen continent, currently in the height of its summer season, was plunged into darkness on Saturday morning. Solar eclipses occur when the moon passes between the sun and the earth, casting a striking shadow, blocking out the light of the sun. For an eclipse to be total, the sun, moon and earth must directly align. The last total solar eclipse occurred in Antarctica in 2003. The next one is not expected until 2039. Tens of thrill seekers, who paid €35,000 for the privilege, braced the icy temperatures from the Union Glacier camp, some 1,000 kilometres north of the South Pole. According to NASA, a partial eclipse was also visible in parts of the Southern Hemisphere, including Lesotho, South Africa, Chile and Australia.
That's it for this edition. Thank you for watching. See you next time.